Hey guys, it's been a while. I just wanted to make a quick video about masculinity, and this is a really it's a hard subject to talk about. It's really triggering. It's easy to say the wrong thing, um, and it's hard to not say something that's going to be inflammatory to someone. So, with all that being said, I'm going to dive right in. First of all, this video is specifically for trans men, and I know that statement in itself is going to be inflammatory to some people. But here's the thing. There are times when information is, in fact, directed to a certain group of people, and there's nothing wrong with that. Making all information directed to all people at all times is not possible, and it at times waters down the message. So while anybody who wants to watch this video can watch this video, and maybe multiple groups of people will find some value in it, the information that I'm presenting and my thoughts and my use of language is going to be directed towards trans men. So do with that what you will. Alright, so with that being said, I'd like to talk about why this video is directed specifically at trans men. So masculinity comes about in two different ways. We are all, those of us who identify as masculine, come about our masculinity naturally. We're born with a more masculine mindset, brain, whatever you'd like to call it. The second way masculinity is formed in us is socially, because part of everyone's masculinity is a social construct. And that is why this video is aimed towards trans men, because a great many trans men were socialized, at least partially, as girls and women for part of their life, and didn't have the male role models that many boys and men did. And whether those were good role models or bad, they were still masculine role models that were freely offered to boys and men, whereas they may not have been to girls and women. So many trans men, upon growing up and into adulthood, or even if you're transitioning when you're older, upon your masculinity, a trans man's masculinity is less of a social construct of masculinity and more of a self-construct of masculinity, if that makes sense, because you have the opportunity of looking around at masculinity and deciding what type of man you're going to be. And it's true, even cis men have that opportunity. However, it's in a different set of circumstances. So a trans man needs to decide what type of man he's going to be. And that's the subject of this video. Choosing what type of man you are going to be. And a transgender man has a different set of pressures when it comes to masculinity than a cis man does. For some reason, and I don't know why it is, but masculinity comes with a set of pressures when it comes to being macho. And that's true with cis men and trans men alike. The problem is that trans men have an added pressure because when they begin their transition, the whole world, it seems, is looking to prove they are not man enough, or they are not a man, or this is a psychological problem, or an array of disgusting things I'm not going to say needs to happen to them to just prove that they're not a man and they are in fact a woman. And so this added pressure to be hyper masculine presents itself when a trans man is becoming himself. And unfortunately, many of us bite onto this idea and we become hyper masculine more masculine than we would naturally want to be. And unfortunately, a lot of times, along with hypermasculinity comes a very, very toxic form of masculinity. A form of masculinity that is based on pushing power and being abusive and being excessively loud, taking up too much space, and essentially being a masculine bully. And none of those things are okay. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that and get it out there, because the pressure to be hypermasculine is very real for the trans man for so many reasons. And so what I'm offering all of you who are transitioning, what I'm offering you is a request, essentially, to really stop and think about your masculinity. Because once you get on testosterone and the changes start happening, the pressures of the world start coming in. You have a different set of pressures than you did when you were playing out the female narrative. There's a very different set of pressures. And if you don't stop and think about those pressures and decide what type of man you want to be, you could very easily fall into being a type of man that, quite frankly, we don't need in the world. Because what we need in the world are kind men, mindful men, thoughtful men, men who use their power and their privilege to raise everyone up rather than squish people down. That's what... I had to pause the video because I didn't know where I was going with it. There are so many places to go with it. But here's the thing. I can't go any of those places because I can't define your masculinity. Your masculinity is different than mine, and it's different than everyone else's. How I go about in the world and display my masculinity is going to be different from everyone else, trans and cis alike. And who you are and who you're going to be is a decision that you need to make. But with that being said, the decision needs to be made with a great deal of thought and care. Because when you decided to transition, you are transitioning into a position of societally created power and privilege. And that is not a responsibility that should be taken lightly. You need to use your power and privilege that you did nothing to earn, except you were born male, and you are now in the process of realizing that, or not realizing it, but the realization, it's happening, it's coming forth. And that has caused you to step into privilege. And that privilege needs to be used to make things better, regardless of the intense pressure you are going to receive from the world to be hypermasculine. Because right now, and throughout history really, hypermasculinity has been glorified. And that has been the bar to reach. And it needs to stop. And so what I'm asking all of you trans men who are transitioning, and age has nothing to do with it, I'm asking that you choose a better form of masculinity. And like I said, I can't tell you what that is, but I can tell you what it isn't. It isn't a toxic masculinity that uses its power to push people down and harm people. So find your masculinity, and no matter what it looks like, that's fine. But use it for good and use it to help instead of making things worse. That got kind of deep and dark, I'm sorry.